The old Ford roared to life as we took a sharp turn onto an empty, moonlit road. The plan was simple. A late-night trip to nowhere in particular. Just my cousin, Eric, me, a full tank of gas, and a craving for something mysterious. Eric was always obsessed with urban legends. This time, he was going on about one of his favorites, the Desert Wanderer. I laughed it off, gripping the wheel a little tighter. "It's just a dumb story," I muttered. But Eric's eyes were fixed on the dark woods outside. "Don't knock it until you've seen him," he said. The road stretched out endlessly, the towering trees forming a suffocating tunnel. The headlights barely cut through the thickening fog. The GPS had glitched out miles ago, but we didn't care. This was part of the adventure. Then we saw it, the sign. It was old, bent at a strange angle. It read, Route 19. Bullet holes riddled its surface. Someone had scrawled in red paint beneath it. "You don't belong here." A chill ran through me, but I kept my voice steady. "What do you think?" I asked, half joking. "Should we turn back?" Eric smirked. "Turn back now? This is where the fun begins." So we pressed on. A big mistake. The road seemed endless, a ribbon of cracked asphalt stretching deeper into the unknown. The fog had thickened so much that the world beyond the headlights barely existed. We drove in silence now, the thrill of adventure giving way to a gnawing unease. Eric tapped his fingers on the dashboard, his confidence visibly waning. "You think we should turn around?" he muttered. I wanted to say yes. Every fiber of my being screamed to find a way back to safety, but pride and stubbornness kept me going. I shook my head. "We've come this far. It's probably just some freak weather. We'll hit a clear patch soon." The words sounded hollow even to me. The radio crackled again, static bleeding through the speakers like whispers from the void. I reached out and turned the dial, hoping to find anything that would break the suffocating silence. But the only thing I found was a faint, rhythmic hum, a sound that felt almost alive. Eric's voice was tight. "This is seriously starting to creep me out." "Yeah," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Me too." The road ahead seemed to shimmer in the fog, the lines on the asphalt warping as if the ground itself were shifting. My hands felt numb on the wheel, the chill from outside seeping into the car. Then, out of nowhere, a shape emerged in the mist. A deer? Number. It was too tall, too human. I slammed the brakes. The Ford skidded, tires screeching as we came to a stop just inches from the figure. My breath caught in my throat as I squinted through the windshield. The figure stood motionless, cloaked in a tattered black coat that fluttered slightly in the cold breeze. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed its head, but the face, or rather the absence of it, made my blood run cold. Where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless void. My heart pounded in my chest. Eric's voice was a shaky whisper. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I said, my throat dry. "But it's not human." The figure raised one long, bony arm and pointed directly at us. The gesture was slow, deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. A low, guttural hum filled the car, vibrating through the metal, through our bones. "Drive," Eric hissed. "Now!" I didn't need to be told twice. I stomped on the gas pedal. The tires spun for a moment before finding traction, and the car lurched forward. The figure vanished into the mist behind us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't gone anywhere at all, that it was still watching. Always watching. We drove faster than was safe, the fog blurring past like ghostly shapes. My hands trembled on the wheel, sweat dripping down my spine despite the cold. "Did you see its face?" Eric asked suddenly. I swallowed hard. It didn't have one. He nodded, his eyes wide and haunted. "Yeah, that's what I thought." The road refused to change. No matter how far we drove, the scenery remained the same. Thick forest, dense fog, and the oppressive dark. My phone was dead. The Ford's clock still read 1:13 a.m. The numbers frozen as if time itself had given up on us. "This isn't right," Eric muttered, his voice cracking. "We should have hit something by now. A town, a gas station, anything." I knew he was right. The road felt like a loop, a twisted Mobius strip that kept folding back on itself. Then the headlights flickered. "No, no, no," I whispered, banging the steering wheel. "Not now!" The engine coughed, sputtered, and went silent. The car coasted to a stop. The only sounds were our ragged breaths and the distant echoing drip of water, though from where I couldn't tell. "Try the engine again," Eric said, his voice tight. I turned the key. Nothing. The fog pressed in closer, the world shrinking until the car felt like the last point of existence. I reached for the door handle, hesitating. "We can't just sit here," I said, more to myself than to Eric. "We need to figure out where we are." Eric nodded, but his eyes darted around the fog, wary. "Fine, but we stay together." I pushed the door open, the cold air hitting me like a wall. The fog was thicker outside, almost tangible. Every step felt like wading through molasses. We walked around the car, the gravel crunching beneath our feet sounding far too loud. The headlights barely illuminated the road ahead, but something in the mist caught my eye. Footprints, leading away from the car. My mouth went dry. "Eric, do you see that?" He followed my gaze and paled. The footprints were fresh, clearly defined, and they led straight into the darkness. Worse, they weren't ours. A shiver crawled up my spine. "Who else could be out here?" Eric whispered. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we weren't alone. A noise broke the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like boots on pavement. It was coming closer. "Get back in the car," I hissed. But Eric wasn't listening. He was staring into the fog, his eyes wide with terror. Then I heard it too, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "You don't belong here. You don't belong here." The whisper crawled under my skin, cold and relentless. It came from everywhere and nowhere, wrapping around us like the fog itself. My stomach knotted, my muscles tensed. "Eric," I hissed, grabbing his arm. "We need to get back in the car, now!" But Eric wasn't moving. His eyes were wide, locked on something deep within the fog. Then the footsteps started again. Slow, deliberate, boots tapping against the asphalt. The sound was impossibly loud, echoing inside my skull. It was getting closer. "Eric!" I shouted this time, my voice cracking with panic. That snapped him out of it. He stumbled back, his legs shaking. We rushed to the car, the door hinges squealing in protest as we climbed in and slammed the doors shut. The silence inside the Ford was suffocating, broken only by our ragged breaths. I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would shatter my ribs. "Do you hear it?" Eric whispered, his voice trembling. I nodded. The footsteps hadn't stopped. They were circling the car now, slow and measured, like a predator toying with its prey. Tap, tap, tap. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The fog outside was so thick it seemed like the world had vanished beyond it. But there, just at the edge of visibility, a shadow moved. A tall figure in a tattered coat and hat, its faceless head tilted slightly as if listening, watching. "Start the car," Eric breathed. "Please, just try it again." I turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and miraculously roared to life. Relief washed over me. I didn't care how or why it worked. "Hold on," I muttered, slamming the gas pedal to the floor. The tires squealed and the Ford lurched forward, tearing through the fog. The shadow disappeared behind us, swallowed by the mist. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, just out of sight, keeping pace with us. We sped down the road, the fog whipping past in ghostly tendrils. The speedometer needle crept higher, but no matter how fast we went, the road refused to change. The same cracked asphalt, the same twisted trees. It felt like we were driving in place. I glanced at the clock. 1:13 a.m. It hadn't budged. "We're stuck," Eric whispered. "It's like we're trapped in some kind of loop." I shook my head, trying to fight the rising panic. There has to be a way out. But even as I said it, doubt gnawed at the edges of my mind. We drove for what felt like hours, the road stretching endlessly before us. The silence was worse than any sound, a heavy void that pressed on my chest. Eric slumped in his seat, his face pale, eyes hollow. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'll get out of this. We just need to keep going." He didn't answer. He just stared ahead, unblinking. And then I saw it. A light. A faint glow in the distance, barely visible through the fog. My heart leapt. "Look," I shouted. "A light! That has to be a gas station or a house." Eric snapped his head up, his eyes desperate. "Go, go!" I pressed the pedal harder, the car groaning as it surged forward. The light grew brighter, cutting through the fog like a beacon. We were so close. But then just as we reached it, the light flickered and vanished. "No!" I screamed. We barreled forward into darkness. The road disappeared beneath us, and suddenly we were falling. The car hit the ground with a bone-jarring crash. The engine sputtered and died. Everything went black. When I came to, the air was cold and still. My head throbbed and my vision swam as I tried to focus. The windshield was cracked, the dashboard lights flickering weakly. "Eric?" I croaked. No answer. I turned to the passenger seat. It was empty. The door was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Panic surged through me. "Eric!" I shoved the door open and stumbled out, my legs shaky. The fog had thinned, revealing a landscape that made my blood run cold. We weren't on the road anymore. We were in a clearing, surrounded by dead trees. The ground was cracked and dry, like a desert, and in the center of the clearing stood the figure, the desert wanderer. He was taller than I remembered, his coat fluttering in an unseen wind. The brim of his hat cast a shadow over his featureless face. He raised one long arm and pointed at me. My breath caught in my throat. "Where's Eric?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but in my head, I heard the whisper. "You don't belong here." The ground beneath me trembled. The air grew colder. Shadows oozed from the cracks in the earth, curling around my feet. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The shadows climbed higher, wrapping around my ankles, my knees. "Please!" I screamed. "I just want to go home!" The wanderer tilted his head slightly, as if considering my plea. Then he stepped closer, the sound of his boots on the dry ground echoing in my skull. Tap, tap, tap. He leaned in, his faceless void inches from my face. A cold, hollow voice echoed in my mind. "There is no home. Not anymore." The shadows surged up, covering my body, filling my mouth, my eyes. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. And then, there was nothing. I don't know how long the darkness lasted. It felt endless, like I was suspended in a void, my thoughts unraveling. I was no longer sure who I was or where I came from. My memories floated around me like shattered glass, sharp and fragmented. Then a sliver of light. It was faint at first, a tiny crack in the endless black. The crack widened and light poured in, blinding me. I gasped for air, my lungs burning, my body trembling. I was lying on my back, staring up at a pale gray sky. The air was cold and dry, carrying the faint smell of dust and decay. I struggled to sit up, every muscle screaming in protest. The clearing was gone. I was back on the road, or at least what was left of it. The asphalt was cracked and broken, like it hadn't been used in decades. The fog was gone, replaced by a dull, oppressive stillness. I looked around, my heart sinking. Eric was nowhere to be seen. "Eric!" I called, my voice hoarse. It echoed back at me, thin and lifeless. "Eric, where are you?" No answer. I staggered to my feet, my legs shaky. The Ford was a twisted wreck, the hood crumpled, the windshield shattered. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. Vines curled around the tires and rust gnawed at the metal. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. The screen was cracked, but it flickered to life. My heart leapt with hope, until I saw the time. 1:13 a.m. The numbers glared at me, unchanging. I took a shaky breath and looked down the road. It stretched out in both directions, empty and lifeless. The trees were dead, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. I had to find Eric. I started walking, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The road crumbled beneath my feet, the ground dry and brittle. My breath fogged in the cold air. As I walked, I felt it again, that oppressive sense of being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up and my skin prickled. I turned around, half expecting to see the figure behind me, but there was nothing. Just the road, disappearing into the gray. I kept walking. Minutes stretched into hours, or maybe it was the other way around. Time felt meaningless here. My thoughts grew fuzzy, disjointed. My legs ached, my head throbbed. And then I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, a silhouette against the pale sky, the wide-brimmed hat, the tattered coat, the empty faceless void, the desert wanderer. He was waiting for me. I froze, my mouth dry, my limbs trembling. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The wanderer raised one long, bony arm and pointed, not at me, at the ground. I followed his gesture and saw a second set of footprints, smaller, familiar, Eric's. The prints led off the road, disappearing into the dead forest. I looked back at the wanderer. His head tilted slightly, as if giving me permission. I swallowed hard and took a step toward the forest. The wanderer didn't move. He simply stood there, his arm still outstretched. I turned away from him and followed the footprints, each step feeling like it took a piece of me with it. The forest was cold and silent, the ground brittle under my feet. The footprints wound through the dead trees, leading me deeper into the gloom. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. "Eric!" I called. "Eric, it's me! Where are you?" The silence swallowed my words. I kept going, my eyes locked on the trail of prints. They twisted and turned, sometimes doubling back on themselves, but they never stopped. I followed them blindly, my mind a haze of fear and desperation. And then, the prints ended. I stood in a small clearing, the dead trees forming a twisted circle around me. The footprints stopped abruptly in the center as if Eric had vanished into thin air. "No," I whispered. "No, no, no." I spun around, searching the shadows. "Eric, please!" A soft whisper answered me, carried on the wind. "You don't belong here." I fell to my knees, tears blurring my vision. "Please," I begged. "I just want to go home." The air grew colder, the shadows deepened, then from behind me the sound of footsteps, slow, rhythmic, tap, tap, tap. I turned around slowly. The wanderer stood at the edge of the clearing, his faceless void watching me. He raised his arm one last time and pointed at my chest. A cold, hollow voice echoed in my mind. "You're next." The world shattered around me. The trees splintered into darkness. The ground crumbled beneath me. I was falling, tumbling into an endless void. I screamed until there was nothing left. I woke up in my bed, the morning sun streaming through the blinds. My heart pounded in my chest, my body drenched in sweat. I sat up, gasping for air, my hands trembling. It was a dream. It had to be a dream. But then I looked at my hands. They were scraped and bloody, tiny shards of glass embedded in my palms. I stared at them, My mind reeling. The Ford was gone. Eric was gone. And on my nightstand, a single scrap of paper. 3 words, smeared in jagged handwriting. Stay off roads. My breath caught in my throat. Then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Outside my window. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't dare look. It doesn't matter where I go, where I hide. The desert wanderer always finds you, and one day he'll take me too.